Close your eyes and imagine yourself floating gently down a narrow canal in the Valley of Mexico. It is the year 1450. The sun is rising slowly, casting a golden shimmer on the water's surface. Around you, the air is thick with the smell of damp earth, the sound of soft paddles pushing through the lake and birds calling in the distance. As you drift closer to the shore, you notice something remarkable. The land doesn't end where the water begins. Instead, it continues. Long rectangular plots edged with reeds and shrubs appear to float on the water. These are chinampas, the so-called floating gardens of the Aztec world. But chinampas don't actually float. That's a myth. They're anchored, fixed to the lake bed, born from mud, reeds, and human labor. And they are one of the most quietly ingenious agricultural systems ever developed. Let's go back to the beginning, not the mythical beginning of gods and legends, but the slow, muddy beginning that no one sings songs about. A lake with problems. The Valley of Mexico was a tricky place to build an empire. Its heart was a shallow lake system, split between freshwater and brackish water. The lake, called Texcoco, the largest, was salty and practically useless for farming, but to the south near Xochimilco and Chalco, freshwater lakes offered hope. They were shallow, rich in biodiversity, and most importantly, they were calm. The Aztecs weren't the first to farm there. Earlier cultures like the Xochimilca had already begun experimenting with building artificial land, but the Aztecs, with their taste for refinement and scaling everything to imperial levels, took the idea to an entirely new degree. Foundation by hand at Chinampa began with a plot marked out in the shallow lake, usually in a long rectangle, about 30 meters long, and 4 meters wide. Farmers drove wooden stakes into the lake bed to mark the borders. Then they wove wattle fences with willow branches and reeds between these stakes. This became a kind of fence, porous but strong enough to hold materials inside. Then came the hard part, filling the frame. Layers of mud from the lake bed, rotting vegetation, and silt were dragged by hand, often in baskets, and dumped into the enclosure. The result wasn't elegant. It took months, even years, to build up a stable platform above the waterline. What made it work was patience and repetition. The farmers didn't rush. They added layers, let it rest, added more. In time, the platform became solid and fertile, with excellent drainage and nutrient-rich soil. Natural boundaries. To reinforce the edges, they planted fast-growing willow trees called ahuejotes along the perimeter. Their roots stabilized the chinampa and also absorbed excess water. The trees also provided partial shade and wind protection, and their branches could be used for tools or kindling. No fences, no bricks, no cement. Just biology and geometry. An eco-loop. Everything in this system was part of a loop. Waste from the city of Tenochtitlan, kitchen scraps, human waste, ash, was ferried out to the chinampas and turned into fertilizer. Water from the lake kept the roots moist. Aquatic plants filtered the water. Fish and amphibians swam in the canals, and their presence helped control insects. In this way, the Aztecs turned a swamp into a garden, not with machines, but with baskets and baskets of mud. They didn't plant just anything. Chinampas were best suited for crops that grew fast and could be rotated frequently. Corn, of course, but also tomatoes, chilies, squash, amaranth, and herbs like epazote and cilantro. Some farmers even grew flowers, marigolds and dahlias, both, for rituals and for trade. A city that fed itself. At the height of the Aztec Empire, it's estimated that over 20,000 hectares of chinampas surrounded Lake Xochimilco and Lake Chalco. That's nearly 50,000 acres of artificial land, producing food year-round. Each chinampa could yield 4 to 7 harvests per year. That kind of productivity was unheard of in Europe at the time. No wonder Tenochtitlan, the capital, could support a population of 200,000 or more, possibly more than London or Paris in the same era. But the system didn't just feed people. It required people. Every family that tended a chinampa passed down knowledge orally, how to maintain the soil balance, when to dredge, how to build canal walls that wouldn't collapse in the rain. No textbooks, no manuals, just generations of watching and working floating. But rooted, to walk on a chinampa felt almost like walking on earth, but it was spongier. If you weren't careful, you could misstep and sink your foot into the edge, muddying your sandals and your pride. The canals between plots were narrow, just wide enough for a canoe, which was the main form of transportation. Goods, tools, compost, all traveled by paddle. You can imagine how silent the place might have been. No carts, no horses, just the sound of water, frogs, and the occasional creak of a boat against the reeds. Even today, some parts of Xochimilco preserve remnants of this system. Tourists come for the floating parties on brightly painted trajineras, but behind the noise and color, a few real chinampas still grow crops in the old way. It's a fragile echo, but it's there. And yet, one has to wonder, how did such a simple and slow process sustain such a vast and powerful empire? What hidden forces turned mud into empire? You wake up before the sun. The air is cool, and dew clings to the edges of the woven mat where you sleep. There is no rooster to call the day. Only the soft splash of paddles outside. A neighbor is already drifting by in his canoe. He nods but does not speak. The day begins in silence. This is the life of a chinampa farmer. No palace, no parade, just mud, water, plants, and quiet purpose. Let's slip deeper now, not just into the system, but into the lives of those who kept it going. Division of labor. And the family plot farming chinampas was not a solitary job. Most plots were owned and maintained by families. A single plot could feed a household if managed properly, and some families maintained several, creating a small web of floating fields passed down through generations. Sons were trained early. A boy might first be given the job of clearing duckweed from the water surface. Then he'd help haul muck from the canal bed in a woven basket. Bit by bit he'd learn the seasons, not just spring or fall, but the dozens of micro-seasons encoded into Aztec agricultural life. Women had their role, too, and it wasn't only in the home. While men dredged mud and reinforced canal walls, women planted and harvested herbs, tended chilies, sorted flowers for sale at the market, and maintained the family's compost. No hour of the day was wasted. From sunrise to nightfall, work cycled, in rhythm with the land. But it was quiet work. Even communal efforts, rebuilding a collapsed bank, repairing a reed barrier, were done with minimal fuss. There were no overseers yelling orders, no taxmen lurking with clipboards. Accountability was social, the fields were interlinked. One neighbor's neglect could flood the rest. This meant that the survival of one plot depended, silently, on the care of all. The calendar of dirt, the Aztecs had two calendars. One tracked the sun, 365 days like ours. The other was the ritual calendar, 260 days long. These two calendars intertwined like gears, repeating every 52 years in what they called the binding of the years. But for chinampa farmers there was a third calendar, one made of dirt. It told you when to dredge, when to plant maize, when to rotate with beans to replenish the soil. It told you when the canal walls might slump in the rainy season, and when to brace them. It wasn't written down, it lived in memory, passed from elder to apprentice. There were seasons for mud, for reeds, for insects, for mushrooms. Even the flowering of aquatic lilies marked the turning of a task. And if the rhythm broke, say, if the rains came late or the lake flooded, the whole system suffered. Trade without coins. The Aztec world ran on barter, and chinampa farmers were key players in the silent economy. Every few days, farmers would load their canoes with produce, squash blossoms, chilies, epazote, tomatoes, and head toward the great market at Tlatelolco, the twin city of Tenochtitlan. The journey through the canals might take hours. It was slow, careful paddling through a green maze. There were no coins exchanged. Goods were traded by value and volume. Chilies might be swapped for salt, a bundle of flowers for a grinding stone. Some even used cacao beans as tender, but only in urban areas. Farmers learned to haggle, not loudly, but with subtlety. The number of items in a bundle, the freshness of the herbs, the presence of ceremonial marigolds could raise the price. They might return home with salt, obsidian blades, woven cloth, or perhaps nothing, just the knowledge of what the market lacked that day and what to grow next. The spiritual side of mud farming was not only practical, it was sacred. Before each planting, a quiet offering was made to the gods, a small piece of food buried in the corner of the field. A whisper to Tlaloc, the rain god, whose moods could shift between gentle mist and cruel hail. During dry years, Chinampa farmers joined city dwellers in ceremonies begging the gods for rain. Children's tears were gathered, literally, as symbols of the rain they hoped to call forth. Tlaloc's temples were decorated with blue tiles and aquatic creatures, but here, on the Chinampas, worship was more modest. A gesture, a glance skyward, a flower tied to a reed. Biodiversity, on purpose Chinampas, were not monocultures. Farmers intentionally mixed crops to discourage pests and encourage soil health. Beans were planted with corn, squash spread over the ground, suppressing weeds. Flowers drew pollinators and spirits alike. Amphibians like axolotls thrived in the canals. Ducks and herons visited, their droppings adding to the fertility. And fish, tilapia, minnows, swam through the channels, caught with simple nets for protein or fertilizer. Every piece had a place. In modern terms, we'd call it permaculture. But to the Aztecs, it was just common sense. Nothing was wasted. Even fallen leaves were gathered for compost. Even dead fish had a role. Threats from the city. Though Chinampas appeared peaceful, they weren't. Immune to pressure. As Tenochtitlan grew, more and more land was needed. Forests were cut, water levels changed, salt seeped into freshwater lakes. And the emperor's expansionist policies meant farmers were sometimes conscripted, not just into war, but into tribute. The empire demanded maize. It demanded flowers, for ritual. It demanded herbs for medicine and ceremony. Farmers had to produce or risk punishment, yet they had no armies, no influence. Just calloused hands and deep knowledge. Occasionally the calm waters boiled. Disputes over water access, fishing rights, or flooding between neighbors did happen. And in rare cases, sabotage, cutting another's canal barrier to destroy a harvest. But mostly, the system endured not through laws but habit and fear of disruption. No one wanted to be the reason the floating fields failed. The Aztec word for enough. There is a Nahuatl word, mecayotl, which roughly means that which supports a family. It's not just about income. It means stability, groundedness, sustenance. For the Chinampa farmer, their plot was their mecayotl. It didn't just feed them. It held them. There were no grand monuments built to them, no statues. But without them, the empire's markets would have gone empty, its temples without offerings. They didn't need to be remembered. They just needed to be enough. And yet, one wonders, what happened when the waters shifted? When expansion reached its limit? Could a system so delicate survive conquest and concrete? The Spanish didn't understand what they were looking at. When Hernán Cortés and his soldiers first beheld Tenochtitlan in 1519, they compared it to Venice, a city rising from water, crisscrossed with canals, humming with trade, dotted with floating fields. But unlike Venice, it wasn't built with marble. It was built with mud, silent, deliberate, earthen labor, and within 2 short years, they would do their best to erase it all. The siege and the drowning fields. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not a single blow. It was a long series of wounds. Smallpox, betrayals, religious disorientation, superior weaponry. But one of the most damaging acts was also the most mundane, water engineering. During the siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the Spanish cut aqueducts and blockaded lake passages. They flooded parts of the city and drained others. They redirected canals. They brought chaos to a system that relied on balance. Chinampas were not built for war. They could survive drought, pests, and even minor floods, but not the disintegration of the careful equilibrium they depended on. When canal walls were broken, fields collapsed. Salt water intruded from Lake Texcoco. Entire plots withered in days. The quiet farmers, so essential for centuries, were caught in the crossfire of imperial collapse. Some tried to hold on, others fled. Some were killed, and still a few stayed. From Chinampa to Hacienda in the years following the conquest, Spanish authorities reorganized land ownership. The communal Chinampa system was replaced with encomiendas and private holdings. Indigenous, Families were often displaced or forced to work as laborers on lands they had once farmed themselves. New crops were introduced: wheat, alfalfa, European vegetables, and sometimes forced into the chinampa system. Oxen trampled the delicate reed barriers. European tools broke up canal edges. And yet, the system endured. It endured because it was better. The chinampas, left in peace, outproduced Spanish-style plots. The soil remained rich. The drainage, perfect. The microclimate ideal. Even colonial farmers grudgingly acknowledged this. Over time, they stopped trying to replace it, and instead took credit for it. The unnoticed generations through the 1600s and 1700s, life on the chinampas became quieter than ever. The farmers still rose early, still paddled through the canals, but they no longer sent their goods to grand markets. Instead, they sold to local buyers, passing through dusty colonial streets under balconies and church bells. They no longer worshipped Tlaloc, at least not publicly, but they still offered a prayer before planting, perhaps now to the Virgin, or perhaps to the wind itself. Children still learned the calendar of dirt, still dredged the canals by hand, still knew when the fish would spawn and when the lilies would bloom. There were no records kept of these lives, no maps, no titles, only memory. They farmed in the shadows of forgotten temples beside crumbling pyramids now overgrown and ignored, but they farmed still. The chinampas of today, 500 years later, some of those chinampas still exist. You can visit them in Xochimilco, just outside modern Mexico City. You might first see the garish colors of the trajineras, floating party boats with speakers and decorations. But beyond them, farther down the canals, the real chinampas remain. Fewer still farmed traditionally, without chemicals, without tractors, just by hand as they always were. There are quiet conservation efforts, small scattered projects run by farmers and biologists trying to preserve this ancient system. Chinampas are now recognized as part of the world's agricultural heritage. UNESCO has taken note, so have environmental groups, but it's still a fragile survival. Urban sprawl presses in. Water pollution threatens the canals. Tourism brings noise, concrete replaces reeds. And the farmers? They are fewer and older. Still, they rise before dawn. Still, they pull mud from the water. Still, they coax chilies and herbs from soil that remembers. Why it still matters. In a time of climate change, soil erosion, and industrial agriculture, the chinampa offers something strange, a working model of sustainability from a society that no longer exists. It's not high-tech. It doesn't require electricity or pumps or synthetic fertilizers. It just needs time, patience, and care. This is not just about preserving a relic. It's about learning from something humble, slow, and profoundly effective. A system that nourished a city of hundreds of thousands, without noise, without waste. A system whose success depended on not changing the world, but listening to it. A final walk. Imagine once more you are in a canoe, gliding through narrow waters just as the sun rises. The queue. Chinampas stretch beside you like soft green ribbons. You pass rows of marigolds, the scent of damp earth, the echo of frogs. A man in a straw hat raises his hand. He is standing ankle-deep in mud, basket at his side. He does not speak. He nods. You nod back. He is farming land that his ancestors built, with hands that remember what textbooks forgot. And you wonder, if we once knew how to grow so much from so little, why did we stop listening? You may not think much of salt, a pinch on your food, a forgotten shaker on a kitchen shelf, perhaps a bag thrown on ice in winter, but for the people of the Aztec Empire, salt was more than seasoning. It was survival. It was medicine. It was tax. It was power. And at the heart of that power was a quiet, slow-moving struggle not fought with swords, but with salt pans, silent embargoes, and the patient control of trade. This is the story of how Tenochtitlan, a city rising from water, used something as boring as salt to outmaneuver its enemies and build an empire that fed on grain, but ran on sodium. A salty landscape. To understand the significance of salt in the Aztec world, we must begin with geography. The Valley of Mexico was ringed by lakes, but not all were alike. The northern lakes, Texcoco, Zumpango, and Zaltocan were saline, meaning their waters carried a natural salt content due to mineral-rich runoff and closed drainage. These lakes, shallow and still, evaporated under the sun, leaving behind flaky crusts of white gold. To the south, in contrast, lay freshwater lakes like Xochimilco and Chalco, home to the fertile Chinampas. These lakes were agriculturally rich but lacked salt. Salt was rare where crops thrived, and crops struggled where salt was abundant. It was this ecological division, salt above, food below, that shaped the region's political fate. How salt was made. Salt production in the Aztec world was a delicate process. It required no mining, no pickaxes, only evaporation. Artisans would build rectangular salt pans, shallow basins edged with earth or stone, and pour saline water into them, usually drawn from the northern lakes. Over days, the sun would work its slow magic. As water evaporated, salt crystals would form. It wasn't glamorous, it was slow, a labor of waiting and brushing. Workers raked the crystals, dried them on reed mats, then packed them into clay pots or leather bags for trade. Some types of salt were coarse, others more refined. Some were used for food, others for rituals. And in the marketplaces of Tlatelolco, salt had fixed value. It could be traded for cloth, maize, tools, even cacao beans. But behind these crystals lay something more valuable than flavor: control. Who owned the salt? At first, salt was produced locally. Each city-state managed its own sources. But as the Triple Alliance, the political union between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, expanded, so did its ambitions. Tenochtitlan, the rising star among the three, recognized early that controlling salt meant controlling trade routes, and so it began quietly absorbing towns with access to salt pans, not by conquest alone, but through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and strategic tribute demands. One such place was the town of Huaypoxtla, located near the salt-rich Zumpango Lake. It wasn't a powerful city militarily, but its salt pans were of high quality. Tenochtitlan absorbed it into the tribute network, requiring regular shipments of salt to flow southward. Similar arrangements were made with other northern settlements. The result? Over time, the Mexica elites of Tenochtitlan became the central brokers of salt in the valley. They didn't need to produce it themselves. They simply took a portion of what others made, then controlled where it went. Salt as tribute was the lifeblood of the Aztec economy. And salt, boring as it might seem, was among the most common tribute items. Every 80 days, towns under Aztec control were required to deliver goods. Some sent maize, others cotton or cacao, but towns near salt lakes sent baskets upon baskets of the stuff. According to tribute records, some regions had to provide over 4,000 salt packages per period. These weren't generous gifts. They were taxes, strictly measured, carefully tracked, and enforced with penalties. Salt was stored in government warehouses and redistributed based on political and religious need. Priests required specific types of salt for purification rituals. Warriors needed it for food preservation on campaign. Merchants needed it to trade with outer provinces. The more Tenochtitlan expanded, the more salt it needed, not just to feed people, but to keep the machine running. And as demand grew, so did the quiet conflict brewing beneath the surface. The Tarascan roadblock. To the west of the Valley of Mexico lay Michoacán, the land of the Tarascans, a powerful and independent state that remained one of the few unconquered regions during the height of Aztec expansion. The Tarascans controlled significant salt sources near Lake Quetzeo. Unlike the cities in the Valley of Mexico, they weren't subject to tribute. They had their own economy, their own rulers, and most importantly, their own salt routes. Merchants in Tenochtitlan wanted access to this western salt. It was prized for its purity and durability. But the Tarascans were cautious. They knew what the Aztecs did with access. They used it to dominate. Tensions rose. Small conflicts broke out along border towns. Trade slowed. Salt caravans were intercepted. At one point, the Aztecs sent envoys to request an alliance, a polite way of suggesting submission. The Tarascans declined. Thus began a cold war of minerals. Salt as a weapon denied access to Tarascan salt, the rulers of Tenochtitlan turned inward. They doubled down on their internal salt sources, increasing tribute demands from compliant towns. They tightened control over the northern lakes, restricting independent trade. And in some regions, they imposed embargoes, blocking access to salt for enemy city-states, hoping to weaken them over time. For those city-states not yet conquered, this created a difficult choice: submit to the empire and gain access to its salt trade, or remain independent and risk shortages. This was how Tenochtitlan grew, not just with jaguar warriors and obsidian blades, but with bureaucrats, tribute collectors, and the quiet grip of resource control. Salt became a lever, one that moved entire provinces into the Aztec fold. The hidden cost of power. But there were limits. Salt pans required maintenance, canals silted. Climate shifts dried up lakebeds, and when cities overreached, their supply lines frayed. Not every region welcomed Aztec dominance, especially when it meant giving up their independence over something as elemental as salt. Whispers of rebellion stirred in the outskirts, especially among older towns that remembered when they controlled their own trade. Tenochtitlan responded with swift penalties, increased tribute, stricter oversight, and in some cases, military action, all over a mineral that melts on your tongue. And yet, you might ask, how did this unassuming substance help keep Han Empire together? Or perhaps more curiously, did salt also play a role in pulling it apart? The markets of Tlatelolco were never quiet. You arrive just after sunrise, and already the plaza hums with movement. Merchants unfold reed mats and display their goods. Clay pots glint in the sun. Woven cloths ripple in the breeze. Traders call out quantities, fingers flicking in code. There is no coin, only bartered value. And there, under the smells of dried fish and fresh mesa, you catch it, the unmistakable sting of salt in the air. In the world of the Aztecs, salt was more than tribute and power. It was daily life. And it moved not only through lakes and warehouses, but through the fingers of women, the calculations of merchants, and the sweat of porters along mountain roads. Tlaxcalan tensions just east of the Valley of Mexico, the city-state of Tlaxcala stood stubbornly outside Aztec control. The Tlaxcalteca were fierce defenders of their independence. They shared language and customs with their neighbors, but politically, they were outliers. They refused to join the Triple Alliance. And they refused to pay tribute, especially in salt. But the Aztecs still needed access to the eastern markets, so instead of war, they used trade. Aztec merchants would travel to Tlaxcala, disguised as commoners, carrying salt and other goods to barter for obsidian, feathers, and pottery. Over time, these unofficial exchanges blurred the lines between friend and enemy, but it was always tense. Merchants were watched, sometimes harassed, sometimes arrested, and in a few cases, killed. In response, Aztec leaders imposed trade, restrictions on their own merchants, forbidding certain routes or requiring permits. This increased the value of salt and made it a tightly controlled commodity. A mineral became a passport. And a risk. The role of the Pochteca Aztec long-distance merchants were called Pochteca, a class of elite traders who operated under state supervision but with remarkable autonomy. Pochteca weren't just carriers, they were diplomats, spies, tax, agents in disguise, and they often dealt in salt. Their journeys could last weeks or months. They traveled on foot, carrying loads of salt and other tribute goods on their backs or packed onto tumplines, thick woven straps slung across the forehead, balancing baskets. They memorized trade values, knew every shortcut and village mood. They kept tallies in their heads, reported regional unrest, and paid respect to foreign rulers with carefully worded gifts. And they understood the weight of salt, not just physically, but politically. A Pochteca could bring back news of rebellion, or warn that a region was producing too much salt, hinting at an attempt to break free of Aztec regulation. In this way, the salt trade became a web of information laced with risk and reward. Women and domestic salt if Pochteca controlled the long journeys, women controlled the kitchen. Most salt in the empire was used at home. It preserved food, flavored stew, balanced maize, and kept the body cool. It was also used for cleaning wounds, purifying tools, and making ceremonial offerings, but not all salt was the same. Coarse grey salt, called iztatl, was cheaper and used for basic cooking. Finer white salts, tekizatl, were rarer and preferred for rituals and elite use. Black salt, smoked over burning herbs, had spiritual value, and salt mixed with chili powder was sold as a luxury snack. Women managed this complexity. They knew which salt to use, how much, and for what purpose. They shaped household demand. They noticed shortages. They taught daughters how to stretch a pinch further in dry seasons. And in some marketplaces, women even formed salt guilds, informal but powerful groups that controlled prices and exchange terms. When a salt shipment was delayed or a road disrupted, it was often the women who first noticed the impact. Not through ledgers, but through taste, texture, and scarcity at the hearth. Rituals of the sacred grain salt was sacred. It was used in funerals, births, and marriage ceremonies. It was placed on the tongue of infants to welcome them into the world. It was sprinkled over wounds to ward off infection and spirits. It was carried by warriors into battle, tucked into pouches for protection and preservation. Priests used specific types of salt in purification rites. During the feast of Tlacaxipehulistli, when captured warriors were sacrificed, salt played a role in cleaning the altars and preparing ceremonial foods. But salt was also taboo. In certain rituals, it was strictly forbidden, especially those involving fertility or maize planting. Salt was thought to dry the earth, to harden it. So in those seasons, it was hidden away or symbolically removed from homes. The contradiction was accepted. Salt could bless or curse, and in this contradiction, it held its quiet power. The hidden trade routes beneath the grand highways and busy markets lay a web of smaller paths. Salt moved through these forgotten roads, paths walked by farmers, fisherfolk, and part-time traders. A man might carry a single basket of salt to exchange for a woven belt. A woman might trade dried fish, packed in salty leaves, for a jug of oil or a set of clay cups. These microtransactions kept remote villages connected. They balanced supply. They told stories. Salt was not just traded, it was gifted at feasts, offered to guests, wrapped in leaves and handed to midwives, packed with food rations for messengers. Sometimes these transactions weren't recorded, but they mattered. A village that lacked salt for a season might suffer fatigue, infection, or loss of morale. A feast without salt might be seen as a bad omen. A traveler without salt in their bundle was poorly prepared, and so it became a shared responsibility. People whispered about salt the way others whispered about the rain, expected, desired, sometimes feared. Tensions in the grain supply. As Tenochtitlan expanded, it demanded more food. Maize flowed in by canoe and causeway. But with food came the need for preservation. Salt kept fish edible for days. It kept meats from spoiling. It seasoned tamales carried by messengers and warriors across long distances. But this created a pressure. Salt was no longer just a ritual item or a luxury. It was logistical infrastructure. Suddenly, a delay in salt delivery didn't just mean bland stews. It meant food waste. It meant hungry workers. It meant spoiled rations on military campaigns. And so salt merchants began traveling with protection, armed guards, tribute licenses, and government insignia. In effect, salt convoys became mini caravans of national interest. Some rebel towns raided them, others taxed them. And occasionally these disputes turned bloody, not over gold, not over religion, but over small baskets of drying crystals. And so one must ask, as empires stretch and salt becomes essential to hold them together, what happens when that fragile mineral starts slipping through the cracks? When the Spanish entered the Valley of Mexico, they saw obsidian blades, gold ornaments, and bright feathered costumes. But they missed something far more essential. They didn't understand the white mounds at the edge of lakes, or the shallow trenches crusted with brittle flakes. They saw no coinage, no banking system, and assumed there was no economy. They never saw the salt caravans, but long before swords clashed and temples burned, salt was already doing its quiet work, building alliances, dividing rivals, preserving harvests, and feeding armies. In the final days of the Aztec Empire, salt wasn't just a trade good. It was the glue in the cracks of empire. Collapse in the lakes in 1521, as Spanish forces laid siege to Tenochtitlan, salt once again played a silent role. With canals blockaded and supply routes cut, the city began to starve. Food spoiled faster. Maize had to be eaten fresh or ground immediately. Meat rotted in hours. The city's salt stores, normally plentiful, dwindled rapidly. What was once a stabilizing force became a weakness. Without salt, not only did food spoil, but morale withered. Priests struggled to perform purification rituals. Wounds festered. Dried fish reserves disappeared. The bodies of the dead could no longer be ritually prepared. Salt was invisible, but its absence was everywhere, and when the city finally fell, the Spanish dismantled not just its palaces and temples, but its entire economic foundation. Tribute routes, warehouses, market protocols. The mechanisms that moved salt across hundreds of miles were replaced by European models. Models that didn't understand what the salt had meant. Rebuilding the taste in the colonial era, the Spanish brought their own salt traditions. Sea salt from the Pacific coast, new tax systems, crown monopolies on mineral extraction. But the native systems didn't vanish. In quiet corners of the old empire, indigenous families continued to harvest salt in the old way. By evaporation, by hand in silence, they kept the knowledge alive. How to read the wind over a salt pan, how to stir crystals with a reed whisk, how to tell if the salt was suited for cooking or for wounds. They were no longer official tribute workers, just humble producers, but they remembered, and they passed it down, not in ledgers but through repetition. A grandmother showing a child how to feel the weight of damp salt, a grandfather muttering about the proper drying days. Even centuries later, some of those families still exist, not in textbooks, but in routine. The persistence of salt in culture modern Mexico still carries echoes of this legacy. Salt remains central to cuisine, not just in taste, but in preservation and preparation. Dried fish, salt-cured meats, flavored salts in traditional markets, black salt, lime-blended salt. In some rural areas, salt is still gifted during childbirth, or placed under beds to ward off illness, or offered in home altars next to flowers and candles. None of these rituals are traced back consciously to the Aztecs, but they live on anyway, because salt does not need memory. It needs habit. The economics of the invisible, modern economic histories of the Aztecs often focus on tribute lists, on cacao, on cloth, on gold, but salt is rarely mentioned, perhaps because it dissolved into use too easily, perhaps because it left little archaeological trace. But it was everywhere, in every kitchen, in every basket, in every corridor of the marketplace, on every soldier's pouch, in every priest's offering bowl, in every merchant's backroom tally. Empires are often imagined as built on steel, stone, or blood, but sometimes they are built on crystals no larger than a fingernail. A silent legacy today. If you walk the shores of Lake Zumpango, you might find nothing but reeds and silence. The salt pans are gone. The market's changed. The tribute lists burned, but the lake still remembers. Some say if you touch the dried earth in certain places, your fingers will come away tasting faintly of salt. It's hard to say if that's true, but perhaps that's the nature of salt, not to dazzle, not to endure in monuments, but to linger quietly where no one looks. And so you wonder, how many other empires left behind no palaces, no pyramids, no marble inscriptions, only a faint trace of salt in the soil. You step onto the plaza just as the sun lifts above the rooftops of Tlatelolco. The stone underfoot is already warm. Around you, the largest open-air market in the empire is coming to life, not with shouting, but with murmurs. Merchants unfurl reed mats, weavers lay out patterned cloths, farmers balance baskets of herbs on their hips, hunters tie bundles of dried fish with palm string, and everywhere you look, no one is paying with money. This is the Aztec economy, one of the most complex in the pre-modern world, and it ran almost entirely without coins. At the heart of this system, not gold, not silver, but feathers, beans, and codes only experienced traders could truly understand. A marketplace larger than a city. The market at Tlatelolco The sister city of Tenochtitlan wasn't just big, it was enormous. Spanish observers, stunned by the scale, estimated that over 20,000 people gathered there daily. On feast days, the number swelled to 40,000, and yet the system worked, efficiently, predictably, quietly. There were no shop signs, no registers, no printed prices. Instead, the market was organized by zones. Each product had its area. Flowers in one corner, pottery in another, feathers by the east gate, fish near the canal edge. Sellers and buyers knew where to go. Officials patrolled in silence, ensuring weights were fair, arguments stayed civil, and no false goods were passed off. But the real order wasn't enforced by guards. It lived in knowledge, custom, and barter. Codes older than the empire itself. The language of trade without coinage, value had to be communicated in other ways. A seller would hold up a bundle of goods, say 20 avocados tied with a reed strip. The bundle shape alone signaled volume and freshness. The seller might tap 2 fingers against a nearby basket of dried chilies, indicating what they were willing to trade for. Buyers responded with gestures, sometimes counter-offers spoken aloud, but more often with subtle signs: a raised eyebrow, a glance at another seller, a half-turn away to suggest the price was high. Over time, experienced merchants learned this language the way others learn grammar. Bundles had meaning. Colors of thread on woven belts signaled origin and quality. The way a pot was stacked upside down or on its side conveyed whether it was fresh, cracked, or reserved for a particular customer. This was the Aztec market code, not written down, but everywhere. The role of cacao and cotton wile coins didn't exist in most everyday transactions. The Aztecs did use units of exchange that functioned like money in specific contexts. Cacao beans, dried and slightly fermented, were used for small transactions. A tamal might cost 1 cacao bean, a rabbit 30 to 50, a good cloak, a few hundred. But cacao was fragile. It could rot. It was sometimes counterfeited, empty shells filled with dirt. So it was rarely used for bulk or long-term trade. Cotton cloaks, called tilmatli, served as larger denominations. A well-woven cloak represented wealth, status, and could be traded like currency among elites or for large goods like tools or canoes. In the marketplace, these mediums worked alongside barter, but they never replaced it. The economy was layered, flexible, responsive to scarcity, season, and relationship. You didn't just trade goods, you traded trust. Feather merchants and prestige goods, of all the traders in Tlatelolco, none were more respected or more watched than the feather merchants. Feathers weren't just decorative, they were sacred, used in headdresses, shields, fan designs, and ceremonial costumes. Bright green quetzal feathers were especially prized, rarer than gold, and never taken by killing the bird. Feather traders traveled far, from the humid jungles of the south to mountain passes where exotic birds nested. They formed tight guilds, often hereditary, with secret sources and guarded techniques for preserving and arranging feathers. In the market, these merchants displayed feathers in neat bundles, sorted by type, color, and brilliance. Buyers knew the codes. A bundle tied with yellow string might contain hummingbird down. One wrapped in maguey fiber could hold eagle plumes. Barter here was intense. Feather merchants didn't want maize or fish. They wanted obsidian of a certain cut, shells from the coast, dyes from Oaxaca. Each trade was a chain, each item a key to the next link. No price tags, no bargaining tables won. Of the most remarkable facts about the Aztec market system is how orderly it was without fixed prices. How? Because value wasn't set by demand alone. It was governed by memory. Everyone, from highland farmers to central city weavers, knew the approximate worth of everyday goods. They learned it as children. A clay cup equaled a day's worth of beans. A rabbit equaled a small woven cloak. A pile of salt equaled a half day of firewood. Disputes did occur, but they were rare. And if things escalated, judges sat in market courts ready to hear arguments and assign fair resolution. But most times, the resolution happened before voices were raised, through subtle rebalancing of the trade. A seller might add 1 more avocado, A buyer might remove the extra pinch of chili powder. Harmony was maintained not by force, but by flexibility, supply, season, and scarcity. Without coins, the system depended heavily on awareness of time. Dried fish might be abundant in spring and rare by autumn. Chilies were more valuable in wet seasons. Salt had to be conserved during summer. This seasonal flow created a rhythm traders followed carefully. No one published price charts, but the patterns lived in people's minds. Elders taught it to youth. Sellers adjusted their bundles. Buyers planned their purchases accordingly. This made the market resilient. Even when one good failed, due to storm, pestilence, or war, others surged to fill the gap. And yet, the system had a limit. What happened when the rhythm was disrupted by conquest, drought, or outside pressure? Could a barter economy built on trust and memory survive collision with the metal coins of a new empire? And so you may wonder, when trade flows like conversation and memory holds the books, what happens when silence falls on the marketplace? The market, for all its visible bustle, held layers no outsider could see. Behind every neatly tied bundle of maize there were months of preparation. Behind every exchange of chili or obsidian was a path trodden by countless feet across mountain passes, lake shores, and jungle edges. The Aztec economy wasn't just a place, it was a web. A web of people, goods, and silent agreements that reached far beyond the edges of the empire. And while it seemed to run on bartered goods alone, its true fuel was relationship. The invisible hand carriers. Every day, thousands of porters, called tamims, traveled in and out of Tenochtitlan, carrying loads of up to 50-70 kilograms strapped to their backs or balanced across their foreheads. They walked barefoot, they walked in silence, and they walked with purpose. Tamims weren't slaves, but they weren't elites either. They were essential labor, men who kept trade flowing between regions where wheels were absent and beasts of burden didn't exist. From the coast, they carried dried fish, sea salt, and coral jewelry. From the highlands, obsidian blades and woven cloth. From the southern rainforests, cacao, feathers, dyes. They didn't negotiate prices. They didn't sit in market courts, but they remembered the routes. They learned where the dangerous crossings were, which villages offered rest, which hill passes were prone to rock slides. Without them there was no market, yet their names were not written. Their lives passed in footsteps. Market days and rotations. Not every day was market day. The Aztecs followed a ritual calendar where each region had designated days to hold official markets, often on a 5-day cycle. This prevented overlap and ensured traders could rotate between towns. Some markets specialized. Xochimilco was known for flowers and herbs, Cholula for religious goods and incense, Texcoco for elite crafts. Merchants often mapped their travel around these cycles. 1 week, they might begin in Azcapotzalco with baskets of firewood, trade them for clay vessels, and carry those east to Tlaxcala for cloth, then return with salted fish to Tenochtitlan. Each step involved risk, but also deep familiarity, and through this rotation, goods flowed across valleys, mountains, and lakes without a single coin changing hands. Barter and the quiet diplomacy of trade wasn't just economic, it was political. Sometimes trade routes passed through enemy lands. Tensions between Tlaxcala and the Aztecs were constant, but so were the exchanges of goods. Ambassadors might deliver gifts that were really disguised trades. Feather merchants might pay tribute in obsidian and receive safe passage in return. Even Pochteka, the elite long-distance traders, were often tasked with collecting intelligence while trading. They would return not just with feathers or copper bells, but news. Who was allying with whom, where food was scarce, what gods were being invoked in distant rituals. In this way, trade was a listening device, and feathers were as political as they were beautiful. Codes of conduct. Markets operated under strict codes even if they weren't written. You did not misrepresent your goods. You did not pass off old maize as fresh. You did not mix low-quality obsidian in with prized black blades from Pachuca. To do so was not just shameful, it was criminal. Market judges, often elders or nobles, patrolled with quiet authority. If a dispute arose, both parties would be brought Before them, witnesses were heard, a decision made. Sometimes fines were issued, measured in goods, not coin. Occasionally, public shaming occurred. Rarely, but significantly, cheating was punished by physical penalties. The effect? Trade remained clean. Trust stayed intact. People returned to markets where justice was consistent. Spiritual layers of the markets weren't secular spaces. Many had shrines at their edges, dedicated to gods of trade, harvest, and fortune. Offerings were made. Before stalls were set up, a merchant might whisper a prayer over their bundle of herbs, asking for favorable trades or safety from deceit. Certain days were considered more auspicious than others. If a market day fell on the one deer of the ritual calendar, traders might pack extra goods expecting higher exchanges. On 13 rain they might avoid travel altogether, and some goods like incense, obsidian, or feathers were considered spiritually active. Their movement had to be done with care. In this way, commerce and religion intertwined, not in grand rituals but in everyday practice. When trade broke down, trade was stable, but it wasn't invincible. Droughts disrupted the maize flow. War closed roads. Political disputes shut down border markets. Disease reduced porter numbers. In these moments, market rhythms shifted. People hoarded salt. Feather bundles disappeared from display. Judges allowed slight inflation on high-risk goods. Still, the system flexed rather than broke. Communities relied on local barter, reactivated old village paths, or shifted toward seasonal subsistence until the trade returned. There was no panic, only adaptation. The codes held. The feather that tipped the balance among elite goods, feathers remained a symbol of both wealth and diplomacy. A ruler could cement an alliance with a headdress. A priest could mark divine favor with a fan of quetzal, green. A military commander's worth could be read in the colors and layering of his shield's plumage. And yet, it was a quiet industry. Birds were raised in aviaries, not hunted. Their feathers were collected during molting seasons. The best feathers were passed down, reused in new arrangements. Nothing was wasted, and merchants who dealt in them carried not just goods but knowledge of lineages, court tastes, seasonal demands, and sacred meanings. They were artists, economists, and messengers rolled into one. And now you may ask, what happens when this entire code, this entire web of signs and unspoken value, encounters a world where everything has a price, and nothing is bartered? The first time Spanish soldiers entered the market at Tlatelolco, they were stunned. It wasn't the size alone, though it rivaled anything they'd seen in Europe. It wasn't the silence or the rhythm of trade without coin, or even the abundance of unfamiliar goods. It was something subtler. It was that no one seemed to be in charge, and yet everything worked. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that the marketplace was a living memory, 1,000 unspoken agreements, a city of signs, gestures, and bundles, all based on trust, timing, and long-formed relationships. And within just a few years, much of it would be gone. When metal replaced memory, the Spanish didn't understand barter. In their world, value was stamped in silver, weighed on scales, protected in ledgers. They introduced coinage, copper coins, silver pieces, and sought to impose fixed prices on the bustling, flexible economy of the Mexica. It didn't work at first. Most locals rejected the coins. They preferred what they knew. A cacao bean, a small cloak, a bundle of chilies, but slowly pressure mounted. Colonial officials enforced coin transactions for taxes. New markets were built with standardized stalls. Indigenous goods were redefined. Through European categories, luxuries, more staples, more trinkets, but these labels meant little to those who'd spent lifetimes trading by memory. A headdress wasn't a luxury. It was a link to a god, a gift to a daughter, a badge of rank. A dried flower wasn't a commodity. It was medicine, or ritual, or mourning. These meanings began to unravel. The disappearance of the feather guilds, of all the traders, the feather merchants were hit hardest. The Spanish didn't understand feathers. They recognized gold. They admired fabric. But feathers, they considered them curious, occasionally beautiful, but not worth the fuss. When temples were destroyed, so too were the feathered mosaics. Priests who wore elaborate fans of macaw and quetzal were replaced by monks in wool robes. The quetzal bird, once protected, gently plucked by trained caretakers, was hunted freely. Aviaries were shut down or forgotten. Trade routes collapsed, guilds disbanded. Some feather artists tried to adapt, creating Christian imagery using native techniques. A few works remain in European museums, surviving only because they were strange enough to be saved. But the web was broken. A merchant who once knew the feather codes, the trade loops, the color meanings, now had no buyers. And so, they vanished. Theo, currency that couldn't be taxed, cacao beans survived longer. They were too useful, easy to carry, familiar to all. For decades after the conquest, colonial administrators accepted them in local trade, sometimes even for tax payments in remote areas. But cacao was also fragile. When production slowed due to war, migration, or drought, beans spoiled. When Spanish silver became dominant, cacao was deemed unreliable. Worse, it was untaxable. You couldn't melt it down. You couldn't track its flow. And so it was slowly replaced. The quiet collapse of codes as colonial bureaucracy spread. The quiet codes of the marketplace, color, placement, bundle shape, reed ties, faded. Children were taught new weights and measures. Sellers were told to use Spanish rates. Judges were replaced by colonial officials unfamiliar with barter norms. The subtlety of gesture was lost in translation. The trust-based negotiations, the seasonal rhythms, the unspoken social capital, all dissolved under pressure from regulation. Markets remained. Stalls still sold flowers, cloth, maize, but the memory had thinned. Echoes in today's markets yet. Not everything disappeared. Visit a rural market in modern Mexico, and you might see old patterns. A cloth seller tying bundles with dyed string to signal region. A flower merchant arranging stems in odd-numbered groups, an ancient sign of mourning. A woman offering a small packet of salt with her herbs, a gesture that once carried spiritual weight. They don't always know why they do it, but it lingers. A barter here, a gesture there, a quiet persistence, the value that refused to die. The Spanish brought coins, banks, contracts, but they could never fully control meaning. They couldn't tell a farmer what a bundle of maize felt like to grow. They couldn't define the value of a chili grown on a grandmother's plot. They couldn't understand why feathers made a warrior brave. And so, while markets changed, value survived, redefined, reshaped, but not erased. You see it in how people haggle at roadside stalls, in how they say, "This is worth more to me," in how they give without asking, expecting not price but reciprocity. It's not barter anymore, but it's not commerce either. It's something older. A closing image. The sun begins to set over the old market square. The shadows of the stalls stretch across the stone. Merchants begin packing their goods, not with haste, but with quiet care. Bundles are retied. Goods are counted not with numbers, but with memory. A girl helps her mother carry leftover herbs. She doesn't know the name of the trader who taught her grandmother the tying code, but her fingers remember. She adjusts the reed twine, just so it holds. And so you wonder, if value once lived in gestures, memory, and feather, where does it live now? The sun hasn't risen yet. The earth is still cool, the sky just beginning to blush along the eastern rim. You step out of a reed-thatched hut and into dew-damp grass. Behind you, the scent of last night's fire lingers in the air. Ahead, a narrow canal cuts through the landscape like a silver thread, leading toward the day's work. This isn't a battlefield. It's not a temple, it's a garden. And for the average Aztec citizen, it is life. Here in the Chinampa fields, far from the imperial ceremonies and eagle warriors, the quiet rhythm of daily existence plays out. Not with fanfare, but with digging sticks, woven sandals, and the soft splatter of water against wood. This is not the history of kings. This is the history of gardeners. The day begins before the city, wakes long before the streets of Tenochtitlan stir. The farmers have already begun. They rise with the stars still visible, dress in plain maxlattle loincloths or cotton tunics, and paddle silently toward their assigned plots. Some travel alone. Others go in pairs, husband and wife, father and son. A few carry baskets of compost, others light tools. The journey might take an hour. Longer if the canals are choked with vegetation or the canoe is heavy with supplies. The farmers do not complain. The water is calm, the air clean. They paddle by muscle memory. Each family has its own plot, or several depending on lineage and labor. These are chinampas, artificial islands of soil bordered by woven reeds and shaded by willow trees. By the time the first rays of sun touch the water, the farmers are already at work, the tools of the trade. The average Aztec gardener owned few tools, and none of them metal. Iron was unknown in Mesoamerica. Instead, tools were crafted from obsidian, wood, bone, and stone. They were simple but effective. Koa, a pointed wooden digging stick, often hardened by fire, used for planting seeds and tilling soft soil. Kuetlaxpili, a short-handled hoe, made from stone and wood. Tequahuitl, a flat blade used for cutting crops or clearing weeds. Stone weights and nets, used to sink aquatic plants and trap fish in the canals. Woven baskets, for carrying mud, weeds, herbs, or waste. There were no beasts of burden, no plows. Everything was done by hand. Every stroke of the digging stick, every mud basket lifted, was a gesture of patience. These tools weren't sharpened. Daily. They weren't stored in shiny rows, they were used until they cracked, then repaired. Then used again. Composting. Aztec-style gardening meant more than planting. The soil had to be nourished. Carefully. Aztec farmers understood the art of composting. They layered decomposing vegetation, fish scraps, and lake mud to feed their chinampas. Nothing was wasted. Ash from cooking fires, manure from human waste. Even dead insects. Some families created their own blend, tweaking the ratio based on crop type or season. One farmer might add more crushed shells for his tomatoes, another might mix in duck feathers for his maize. The result was a spongy, black, soil rich with life. Chinampas didn't rest. After a harvest, the plot was scraped, remulched, and replanted within days, sometimes within hours. A single chinampa could yield multiple harvests in 1 year, not because of magic, but because of meticulous care. Crop rotation and silent observation. Aztec gardeners didn't have calendars hanging on the wall. They didn't consult books. They watched. The color of the sky, the bend of a willow branch, the nesting patterns of birds. They rotated crops accordingly. Maize one season, beans the next. Squash in summer, amaranth in the dry months. Chilies and herbs were planted along the borders to repel insects and invite pollinators. Crop rotation wasn't just strategy. It was survival. Soil, once exhausted, took years to recover. And so farmers tread carefully, planned cautiously, and shared knowledge through generations. There were no shortcuts, only discipline. A family affair, children were part of the fieldwork early. A 6-year-old might be tasked with collecting duckweed from canal surfaces, used as fertilizer. A 9-year-old might haul small baskets of mud or pull weeds from rows of maize. Teenagers learned how to recognize sick plants, how to balance water levels, how to read the soil's mood. Even elders too frail for heavy lifting had their place. They sharpened tools with stone. They watched the skies. They remembered the flood years and the dry years and when to plant early. There were no schools for gardeners. The chinampa was the classroom, clothing, protection, and weather. The clothing was simple. Men wore cotton loincloths or tunics. Women wore woven blouses, huipils, and long skirts. Sandals were made from agave fibers or leather, but many farmers worked barefoot, better grip on muddy surfaces. There were no gloves. Calluses served instead. Rain was common. So were insects. But there were no umbrellas, no bug spray. Farmers tied woven mats around their shoulders or wore wide straw hats. Some burned dried herbs to keep mosquitoes at bay. Sweat was constant. So were sunburns. But complaining was rare. The land fed you. You fed it back. The sounds of the garden. No machines. No motors. Only the natural rhythm of work. The splash of water pulled from canals. The scrape of a digging stick through damp soil. The the croak of frogs, the flutter of birds, the occasional laugh or shout or whistle between neighbors. It was quiet, but not silent. The chinampa was alive. Even weeds had a place, plucked and thrown into compost. Even pests told a story. Aphids hinted at imbalance. Dragonflies signaled health. A good gardener noticed everything and remembered. And now you might wonder, what happens when this gentle life of mud and patience collides with empire, tribute demands, and an ever-growing city? How did the daily life of the Aztec gardener change under pressure? By the time the city of Tenochtitlan reached its height, its markets teeming, temples smoking, armies marching, the humble gardener found himself at the center of something much larger than a garden. He was no longer just feeding a family, he was feeding a capital. A city of over 200,000 people relied on chinampa produce. And while priests, nobles, and warriors made the headlines of history, it was the gardener, with his canoe and digging stick, who quietly kept the whole machine running. This section tells the story of how the soft soil of the chinampa came under the firm hand of empire. A shift from subsistence to obligation for generations, chinampa farmers lived by the rhythm of the land, planting what their family needed, trading the surplus. But as the empire expanded, this changed. The Tlatoani ruler of Tenochtitlan demanded tribute, not just from distant provinces, but also from nearby agricultural communities. Certain families were assigned quotas, so many baskets of maize, so many bundles of amaranth, delivered every few weeks to the city center. What had once been shared was now measured. Tribute collectors, sometimes accompanied by soldiers, would arrive in canoes to inspect crops and tally deliveries. If the baskets were too light, or the chili too spoiled, penalties followed. The gardener had become an imperial supplier, and the fields, once calm and predictable, became sites of quiet pressure. Feeding the priests, the warriors, the gods, different arms of the state required different things. Temples needed flowers and herbs, marigolds for offerings, sage for purification, amaranth for sacred dough. Warriors required rations of maize cakes and salted vegetables, foods that traveled well. Markets demanded year-round produce, chilies, tomatoes, squash, to meet the expectations of urban buyers. And above all, the gods required perfection. Ritual foods had to be fresh, clean, and symbolically precise. Maize grown during certain moons, chilies without blemish, beans picked before over-ripening. It was a heavy expectation for a farmer with no oxen, no irrigation machinery, and only the rhythm of paddle, stick, and hand. Still, they met it, most of the time, because to fail was not only shameful, it was dangerous. Innovation under pressure necessity pushed farmers to innovate. They began using intercropping techniques, growing multiple crops together on the same plot. Maize formed a tall canopy. Beans climbed the stalks. Squash leaves spread below, shielding the soil. Others introduced succession planting, staggering seed timings so that harvests came in waves, reducing downtime. Still others modified their chinampas, reinforcing edges with double rows of willows to prevent erosion under heavy use. Some even dug deeper canals, allowing more water circulation and better temperature control. These were not grand inventions. No one wrote them down, but they worked, and they helped squeeze more life from the same patch of soil. The chinampa as a microeconomy, many families began treating their chinampas as businesses. One son handled planting, another managed canoe deliveries. A daughter sold herbs at the Tlatelolco market. The mother dried surplus vegetables or wove carrying mats from reeds. Some plots grew luxury goods, rare flowers, ritual plants, fetching better trade. Others focused on volume, rows upon rows of maize. Even tiny chinampas mattered. A 10-meter plot could yield enough amaranth to barter for cotton cloth or obsidian tools. Gardening was no longer just survival, it was enterprise. The quiet competition between farmers, as demand grew, so did competition. Families eyed one another's plots, whose maize grew taller, whose beans came earlier. Some copied techniques, others guarded them. Planting times became secrets. Compost blends were passed down only within family lines. There were no open disputes, but plenty of quiet pride. Occasionally, sabotage occurred. A reed wall mysteriously weakened during the rainy season. A canoe accidentally spilled compost into a rival's canal. Nothing could be proven, and nothing was said, but everyone noticed. Women and the marketplace. While men worked the chinampa, women often handled the trade. They paddled to market at dawn with baskets of fresh herbs, flowers, or vegetables. Their skills went beyond planting. They knew how to display goods for maximum appeal, how to pack chilies for freshness, how to recognize a dishonest deal. In the market, a woman might trade her marigolds for cotton thread. That thread became cloth. The cloth might later be bartered for obsidian or cacao. These women became quiet economic hubs, connecting field, home, and trade route. Their decisions shaped the family's prosperity as much as any harvest. Children of the garden Aztec. Children didn't go to school until about age 15. Until then, they learned by doing. A 5-year-old might be taught to distinguish between weeds and squash vines. A 9-year-old would memorize planting rows. A 12-year-old learned to dig, to cut, to compost. Gardening wasn't seen as low status. It was honored, taught with formality. Even noble children were taught some farming basics, just enough to respect the soil. A chinampa raised not just crops, but citizens. Citizens who understood patience, observation, balance, and who knew that every ear of maize held the weight of a dozen days' labor, the sound of the state. And yet by mid-15th century, the calm of the fields was regularly broken by the sound of paddles not from farmers, but from imperial officials. They came with scrolls and baskets, scrolls listing tribute, demands, baskets expecting fulfillment. They brought rumors from the city, new wars, more festivals, upcoming sacrifices that would require extra flowers or food. Their presence was neither feared nor welcomed, only tolerated, because without compliance there would be no protection, no place in the market, no standing in the empire. Even the quiet gardener was part of the state machine. And you may now ask, when conquest came and the empire fell, what became of these gardeners and their chinampas? Did their knowledge die? Or did the soft soil remember, even as the world around it changed? The smoke rose first, not from the fields but from the city. In 1521, Tenochtitlan burned. The canals ran red, the temples crumbled. Spanish soldiers marched through the sacred causeways, carrying steel, fire, and disease. The Aztec Empire fell, and with it, the great machinery of tribute, worship, and war. But out on the chinampas, the maize still grew. The gardeners kept working because they had no other choice, and because the soil did not care who sat on the throne. When the tribute baskets stopped arriving, with the empire's collapse, the imperial collectors vanished. No more scrolls, no more quotas. No more regular visits demanding baskets of flowers or bundles of beans. For a brief moment there was silence, a strange kind of freedom, but also confusion. What now? Who would take the crops? Would the markets remain? Would war reach the fields? The farmers waited. They watched the canals for signs. And then the new boats came, longer, heavier, with flags they had never seen, with men who spoke words they couldn't understand, with weapons that cracked like thunder, and they brought new demands, chinampas under Spanish rule. At first, the Spanish did not see the value in chinampas. They looked for gold, for silver, for treasure buried in temples. They cared little for soft soil or willow fences, but some among them noticed how the gardens kept producing, how even during sieges and droughts, the chinampas yielded food, how local communities survived while others starved. And so, they did not destroy them. Instead, they claimed them. From gardener to laborer. The same families who once worked chinampas for survival, then for tribute, now worked them for a different master. Spanish colonial officials issued land grants, encomiendas, that turned entire districts into private holdings. Indigenous farmers were told to continue their work, but under new supervision. They were paid, sometimes in cloth, sometimes in grain, rarely in coin. The chinampa remained, but the autonomy was gone. The farmer no longer chose what to plant or when. Crops like wheat were introduced, though they fared poorly in wet soil. Corn was still grown, but now a portion went to colonial lords, and still the digging stick pierced the ground, because people still needed to eat. The disappearance of the itumai. Old tool stone hoes gave way to iron. Digging sticks were replaced with spades. The old reed baskets remained for a while. But over time, even those changed. New forms, new materials, new names. Some farmers held onto their tools out of habit, others out of resistance. But younger generations began to see the old ways as obsolete. Still, some refused to forget. A grandfather buried his father's hoe near the Chinampa edge. A mother whispered planting prayers, now spoken in a blend of Nahuatl and Spanish. The garden had changed, but the gardener still listened to the land. Memory in the mud unlike pyramids, the Chinampas left few grand ruins. No stone foundations, no elaborate carvings, only soil, mud, willow roots. But the soil remembers. Centuries later, archaeologists digging in Xochimilco would find layers of sediment, neatly packed, rich with organic matter. Traces of corn pollen, tiny bits of shell, discarded digging sticks, proof not of conquest but of care. The story wasn't in what was built. It was in what was grown. Quiet resistance. Through cultivation, in time, some gardeners rebelled, not with weapons but with rows of maize. They planted sacred herbs in secret corners. They taught children the old planting times. They refused to let Spanish crops dominate. Others found ways to barter outside the colonial economy, trading flowers and vegetables with local communities in exchange for freedom, for shelter, for dignity. It wasn't a loud resistance, but it was real, and it kept the roots alive. The Chinampa today, centuries later, a few Chinampas still operate, especially in Xochimilco. Most are surrounded by noise now, traffic, tourists, modern buildings. But if you go early, before the trajineras arrive, before the music plays, you might still find a man with a paddle, gliding through a narrow canal. He doesn't wear armor. He isn't a king. He wears a straw hat. He carries a digging stick. He farms quietly, steadily, like his ancestors did before Tenochtitlan rose, like they did after it fell. Final reflection: empires come and go, tributes change, gods are renamed, tools are replaced, but food still grows in soft soil. And somewhere a hand still knows just how deep to push the seed. Before clocks, before calendars, before the idea of March or May, there was maize. It grew slowly. It changed color. It stood tall, then fell. And in that long, patient cycle, the people of the Valley of Mexico saw time itself. They did not separate life from agriculture. They did not measure time in minutes or hours. They measured it in sprouts, in rain, in the angle of the sun. For them, a season was not a name. It was a series of quiet signs, each marking a new task. And so, without writing down a single date, they built a calendar out of corn. 2 calendars, 1 crop. The Aztecs followed 2 sacred calendars. The Tonalpohualli, a 260-day ritual calendar used to guide ceremonies and spiritual timing. The Xiupahualli, a 365-day solar calendar, divided into 18 months of 20 days, plus a short 5-day period of rest. Both calendars ran simultaneously, intersecting every 52 years like gears locking into place. But for farmers, especially maize growers, neither was used alone. Instead, they blended sacred time with lived time, measured not in numbers but in what the land was doing. Maize told them when to begin. The first sign: earth that smells of rain, sometime around late April or early May, the soil begins to change. It smells different, softer, damp even when dry. Birds begin to circle lower. Worms rise closer to the surface. Trees let go of last year's tired leaves. Farmers kneel and run their fingers through the dirt. If it clumps just right, not too dry, not too sticky, they nod. It is time. There is no horn blown, no proclamation made. But throughout the valley, families rise early, grab their hoe, digging stick, and make the first mark in the soil. This is the beginning of the maize calendar and of the year. naming the days after crops. Each of the 18 Aztec months had a name. But among farmers, names were less about formality and more about purpose. The month of Tozostontli, around early spring, meant offerings of bird's blood and flower planting. Etzalcualistli, early summer, meant eating maize and beans together, celebrating survival. Through the rains, Huitzilopochtli, midsummer, meant honoring the corn gods with dances, costumes, and tamales. Each month reflected a different phase of the growing cycle. Planting, sprouting, weeding, watering, harvesting, storing, and perhaps, most importantly, waiting. Time was a loop, not a line. You didn't leave one month behind. You returned to it again and again, marking time with the milpa. The milpa, a traditional mixed field of maize, beans, squash, and other crops, was more than a plot of land. It was a calendar in miniature. When maize sprouted, it marked the third week of work. When squash vines spread, it meant the month of Tlaxocimco was near. When beans reached shoulder height, it was time to prepare for Ochpanistli, the cleaning month. These signs weren't written in ink. They were taught by watching. Grandmothers pointed at curling leaves. Fathers tasted soil with their fingertips. Children learned which insects came before the rain. This was not superstition. It was lived time. Offerings and observances, farming was not just physical. It was spiritual. Before planting, a family might bury small offerings in the soil. A kernel of last year's best maize, a pinch of salt, a tiny figurine shaped from clay. These were not sacrifices. They were greetings. As maize sprouted, songs were sung, not loudly but softly, melodies passed down through generations. When the first ears began to ripen, the eldest in the family might offer one to the fire, thanking the gods for the return of food. Even harvest was not done all at once. The first few ears were picked carefully, with reverence. It wasn't just a crop, it was time made edible. The sun as taskmaster, the Aztecs were expert observers of the sky. They knew the sun's positions at equinoxes and solstices. They built temples aligned with celestial events. But more importantly, they observed how the sun felt. When it warmed the earth at just the right hour, it signaled watering. When it hung high and harsh, it meant work must pause. When it dipped behind mountains early, it hinted at the end of a planting window. The sun didn't tell time. It told when, and the farmers listened. Community rhythm. Entire communities operated on the maize calendar, festivals aligned with harvest. Marriages were timed for post-planting rest periods. Religious ceremonies coincided with new cycles of planting or storing. Even taxes, paid in maize or labor, were scheduled to avoid the busiest fieldwork weeks. When everyone watches the same plants, they share a schedule without writing it down. A missed planting could ruin a year. A late harvest could spoil the yield. So neighbors kept one another on time, not with alarms but with eyes. Time was mutual, responsibility shared. And so you might ask, how did this calendar hold firm when the Spanish arrived with metal clocks, paper dates, and a rigid European calendar? Could a system built from sun and soil survive the ticking of gears? The year 1521 brought more than soldiers. It brought steel and fire, yes, but it also brought something quieter, something less violent but just as disruptive, a new sense of time. The Spanish brought clocks, bells, calendars filled with saints' names and holidays pinned to the Roman Church. They brought fixed schedules, printed dates, and the division of days into hours. But the Aztec farmer did not count hours. He counted rain. He counted leaves. He counted the soft rustle of maize in the wind and the appearance of a certain bird in a certain month. And when these two ways of marking time collided, sunlight and shadow, gear and grain, the maize calendar trembled, but it did not fall. The arrival of the Christian calendar under Spanish rule, the Xiuhpohualli and Tonalpohualli, were banned. Priests declared them pagan. Temples were torn down, ceremonies forbidden. The calendar of maize, tied so closely to agriculture, was dismissed as superstition. Instead, the colonizers imposed the Julian calendar, 12 months, 7-day weeks, with fixed feast days for saints, martyrs, and Christian holidays. Church bells rang at regular intervals, marking time for prayer, work, and rest. Time was no longer circular. It was linear. You didn't return to planting month. You left April and entered May, but the maize didn't care. It still sprouted when the soil warmed. It still reached upward at the same pace, regardless of which saint was honored on paper, and the farmers quietly still watched it. Resistance in observation. Though forced to adopt the Christian calendar publicly, many farmers privately continued to observe their ancestral signs. They still bent low to test soil with their fingers. They still watched for the first return of dragonflies as a signal of the rainy season. They still honored the maize with small, hidden offerings, perhaps no longer to Tlaloc or Chikamacotl, but to the earth or the spirits. Old songs were hummed under breath, and children were taught to read the plants, not the clock. This quiet resistance kept the maize calendar alive, not as an institution, but as a behavior. Time in the Chinampa. Nowhere was this blending of calendars more evident than in the Chinampas. Spanish rule brought changes, new crops, tribute shifts, and reorganization of land ownership. But the seasons in the canals remained the same. The cycle of growth could not be rushed. A farmer might mark his planting in late March as ordered, but he still waited for the night winds to shift, for the smell of the earth to turn sweet, for the frogs to sing louder. He might nod at the priest's instructions, but plant when his grandmother had taught him to. The maize remembered, and so did he. The church and the crop-in. Some cases, priests observed that their efforts to change planting habits were ineffective. Maize would still be planted at the wrong time by European reckoning, but somehow yielded strong harvests. Gradually, a compromise emerged. Christian saints were aligned with agricultural phases. Saint Isidore, the patron saint of farmers, was celebrated in spring. Local festivals were renamed but allowed to continue. Processions were permitted, as long as crosses replaced old gods. But underneath the banners, the rhythms stayed the same. The feast of Corpus Christi might include a harvest dance that was older than the church itself. The date had changed. The meaning had not. When rain refused to obey the calendar, one of the clearest conflicts came with rain. In Europe, planting followed relatively predictable seasons. But in the Valley of Mexico, rainfall could shift subtly from year to year, sometimes by days, sometimes by weeks. Spanish officials insisted on set planting windows, often based on European models. But maize does not sprout on schedule. It sprouts when the rains fall. Not before, not after. And so Aztec farmers continued to plant based on signs. Soil feel, air moisture, the timing of certain insects. Their calendars lived in the fields, not on paper. And over time, even the colonizers began to respect this. They didn't understand it, but it worked. Teaching time in secret. The younger generations, taught in church schools, learned the months of the year, January, February, March. But at home, they also learned when the first wind came, when to listen for the tlapalotl moths, when the maize whispers as it grows. Some families used both systems. They might say, "We'll plant in mid-April," and then add, "but only if the ants move early." Grandfathers used both hands when teaching. One hand held the printed calendar, the other dug into the soil, and the children learned to trust the one that smelled like earth. A calendar that breathes. Even now, the maize calendar survives in small ways. In rural communities of Mexico, farmers still follow planting cycles based on inherited observation. Agricultural guides in indigenous languages exist that mark time by signs. When the bats return, when the volcano's breath fades, when the wind comes from the east, these are not myth, they are measurement. It is a calendar that breathes, not because it avoids structure, but because it adjusts with nature, and it continues to feed people. So you may ask, if the clock conquered the empire, why did it not conquer the cornfield? Why does maize still grow to the rhythm of footsteps, sky and soil instead of the ticking of gears? In a world now measured by alerts, appointments, and synchronized seconds, it may seem impossible to imagine time as a crop, and yet for centuries in the Valley of Mexico, that is exactly what time was. Something you touched, something you ate, something you listened to as it pushed through the soil. Each stalk of maize was a calendar entry, each ear a record of the season, Each harvest a conclusion, quiet, edible, and complete. But what made this calendar so enduring wasn't the grain alone. It was the way the people built their lives around it, quietly, humbly, season after season. The cycle. After the harvest, the Aztec calendar didn't end with the harvest. It continued. After the final ears of corn were pulled, the remaining stalks were cut and left to dry. The soil was allowed to rest just briefly. Then the chinampa or field was turned over, compost added, and preparations for the next cycle began. Even the empty ground had its phase. In the ritual calendar, this time aligned with Panquetzalistli, the month of banners. A season of war, yes, but also of transition. The gods were thanked for the harvest. Feasts were held. Maize, dried and ground, became tamales, tortillas, and drinks for offerings. The people knew this wasn't an end, just a breath between cycles. Storing the season maize wasn't simply eaten fresh. It was dried, sorted, shelled, and stored in woven baskets or clay pots sealed with mud and ashes. Storage was a skill. Too early and the kernels could rot. Too late and they would crack. If sealed too tight, mold. If left too loose, rodents. Families passed down storage methods with as much care as planting methods. A well-kept pot of maize could last a year. It was insurance against hunger. It was time held in stasis. When a family opened such a pot months later, they were not just retrieving food. They were opening a memory. Time without clocks. Some historians say the Aztecs didn't understand time in a linear fashion. But perhaps it's more accurate to say they didn't need to. They didn't measure productivity in hours. They didn't mark success by days. Instead, they marked moments. When the maize pushed above the soil. When the rains began. When the first harvest meal was shared. When a child planted a seed for the first time. These were not events. They were time itself. Not marked by ticking, marked by growing. Lessons passed through soil elders often taught not by instruction, but by participation. A child learned the planting rhythm by doing, pressing kernels into damp soil, covered gently. With thumb and palm, no lectures, just repetition. And when the child asked, "When do we do this again?" the answer might not be a date, it might be, "When the frogs sing again." Or, "When the breeze moves from the east." Or, "When your hand remembers what the soil feels like." This was the calendar. This was time. Maize as continuity. Even after the fall of the Aztec Empire, maize never left the center of life. Spanish crops came, wheat, barley, but none replaced maize. It remained the base of tortillas, tamales, atole, and ceremonial offerings. Christian saints replaced old gods, but the food at the altar stayed the same. Even today in Mexico and across Latin America, maize remains a cultural constant. Not just a food, but a symbol of identity, survival, and connection to the land. A calendar encoded in cuisine, a history that can be held in the hand, a final morning picture, an early morning, centuries ago, and yet not so different from today. Farmer walks into the field digging stick in hand. The air is cool. The soil smells like last night's rain. The birds are just beginning to stir. He kneels, touches the earth, and pauses, not to check a clock, but to listen, to feel the weight of the season in his hands. He presses a kernel into the ground, and time begins again. So you may wonder, if our ancestors once read time in the rhythm of crops and the color of the sky, is it possible that the future might require us to remember how? Not every voice in the Aztec world shouted from a pyramid. Not every figure held a spear or wore a feathered headdress. Some wore simple cotton robes. Some walked slowly. Some asked questions, not to win arguments, but to understand. These were the Tlamatinaim, the knowers of things. They were philosophers, not in the European sense of writing treatises or founding academies, but in their own quiet, steady way they sought the same thing, to understand the world and how best to live in it. They did not lead armies. They did not claim to speak for the gods. They asked questions and listened. Who were the Tlamatinaimi? The word Tlamatini, plural Tlamatinime, comes from the Nahuatl root tlatoa, to speak, and mati, to know. A Tlamatini was not simply one who knows, but one who could speak wisely, who could advise, interpret, and reflect. They weren't always priests, though some were. They weren't rulers, though they sometimes advised them. They were often elders, teachers, poets, and scribes. You might find them in the Kalmakak schools, teaching noble children. Or in gardens, reciting verses to apprentices. You would rarely see them in ceremonies, but their influence was everywhere, in words spoken softly, in metaphors passed between generations, in questions whispered in times of grief or uncertainty. The Aztec view of philosophy. To the Aztecs, philosophy was inseparable from poetry, ethics, and the search for balance. They called the world in ATL, in Tepetl, the water, the mountain, symbolizing fluidity and stability. They believed life was inherently fragile, like a painting made with smoke, or a flower blooming in the dust. The Tlamatinaim sought to understand this fragility. They asked, if the gods shape fate, where is human freedom? If all things pass, what is worth building? If truth shifts like mist, can it ever be fully known? They did not expect final answers, but they believed that the search itself, neltilistly, the pursuit of rootedness, was sacred. Learning to see with both eyes one. Of the favorite metaphors of the Tlamatinaim was this: to be wise is to see with both eyes, one looking at the earth, one looking at the heavens. This didn't mean believing in gods while ignoring the world. It meant understanding that truth lived in tension. To act wisely, one needed to honor the gods, but also observe reality. To love beauty, but not be trapped by illusion. To speak well, but also to listen deeply. This kind of thinking wasn't taught through lectures. It was taught through poetry, parables, and careful silence. A student might ask, what is the meaning of life? And the Tlamatini might respond, what does a flower do before it falls? Quiet conversations and public roles. In Aztec society, Tlamatinaim were sometimes invited to advise kings. Before a battle, a ruler might call upon a Tlamatini to speak, not to predict victory, but to remind him of the fleeting nature of power. Before a festival, poets would be asked to recite songs, not to entertain, but to reflect on beauty and impermanence. Some Tlamatinaim wrote poetry that survives today, not as doctrine, but as reflection. We only come to sleep, we only come to dream. It is not true that we come to live on this earth. Such verses were not despairing, they were grounding, a reminder to live wisely, with humility. Students of change, the Tlamatinaim, were deeply aware of change. They lived in a society of conquest, an empire that grew rapidly, demanded tribute, and glorified war. They witnessed temples rising and enemies falling. They watched rulers ascend and then vanish, and they knew nothing lasted. Rather than resisting change, they studied it. They saw it as a teacher, a chance to ask, if power is temporary, how should we wield it? If beauty fades, what makes it meaningful? If death is certain, how should we live? These weren't rhetorical questions. They were daily tools for reflection. The garden as a classroom. Many Tlamatinaim taught in gardens, not classrooms, not courts. Gardens. Among flowers, trees, and water channels, they recited verses and spoke in metaphor. A wilting bloom might inspire a lesson on humility. A droplet of water falling from a leaf could become a meditation on time. Students learned by observing, not just words, but nature itself. This mirrored Aztec cosmology. The belief that the divine was present in the ordinary, the wind, the flower, the flame, the tear. To walk through the world was to walk through a library of wisdom, if you knew how to look. And so you might wonder, what happened to this quiet way of thinking when the world they knew was swept away by conquest and Christian doctrine? Could wisdom survive when its metaphors were banned? The year 1521 did not only bring soldiers and steel, it brought collapse. The temples crumbled. The Tlatoani was captured. The gods were renamed, their statues smashed or buried. The war songs fell silent, and Christian bells began to toll, but the questions remained. What happens to a philosophy when its rituals are forbidden? When its metaphors are declared false? When the language it was spoken in is banned from classrooms and courts? For the Tlamatinaim, it was not only a political conquest, It was a philosophical one, and yet they adapted. Philosophy in disguise. After the conquest, public rituals and the Karmakak schools were suppressed or replaced. The Spanish authorities introduced new teachings: Catholic catechism, Latin prayers, rigid scholastic logic. There was no place for metaphors about smoke and wind, no room for flower songs in theology, and so the Tlamatinaim changed their tone. They began speaking in Christian terms, reframing questions about impermanence through biblical stories, echoing their old teachings in new language. An Aztec elder might say life is a dream and then add, just as the Lord teaches us to value the soul over the flesh. To the friars, it was obedience. To the children, it was continuity, a way of remembering through translation. Poetry that survived. Some Tlamatinaim managed to preserve their thoughts in writing using the Roman alphabet imposed by colonizers. In the 16th century, a remarkable man named Antonio Valeriano, educated in both Aztec and Spanish traditions, recorded fragments of Aztec poetry, philosophy, and metaphor. With others, he helped compile what became the Cantares Mexicanos and Romances de los Señores de la Nueva España, collections of Nahuatl poetry, prayers, and philosophical musings. These verses are not sermons. They are echoes, quiet remnants of a tradition that refused to die. My heart is trembling. I see the smoke, I see the fire. Shall I go away like the flowers that perish? These were not the words of resistance fighters. They were the questions of thinkers watching their world change and wondering how to keep thinking. In the houses and gardens, though the Karmakak was closed, philosophy did not vanish. It moved into homes, into gardens, into songs passed from grandmother to child, into the silence between lines of Christian prayer where an elder might add a Nahuatl word or a forgotten verse. In the evenings after the work of the day, an old man might recite to his grandson, "Is there any truth on earth? We only come to sleep, we only come to dream." And the child, too young to remember temples, would still nod, because truth did not need a building, it needed breath. Spanish confusion. Spanish friars were often confused by the Aztecs' relationship to their new religion. Many were devout, attentive, respectful of ritual, but behind their words, the friars sensed something else, an old logic still humming beneath the surface. A priest might hear a villager say, "We offer this maize to thank the Lord," and feel uneasy at the phrasing. Why offer? Why maize? Why? Did the people still bury a few kernels before planting? Why did they build small altars with flowers and smoke? The friars called it syncretism, but to the people it was memory. The philosophical roots of the old world still reached deep beneath the new surface. Questions in a new world, the Tlamatinaim who survived the conquest lived in a strange twilight. They asked new questions. Can wisdom still exist when our gods are forbidden? If we cannot speak the old truths aloud, can we still live them? Is the soul of a people like a seed, buried but not dead? They continued teaching, sometimes in monasteries, as translators or scribes, sometimes as wandering healers, sometimes simply as elders who remembered. They reminded their listeners that all empires fall, and that all truth, even if burned, leaves ash that can speak. What they refused to forget. They refused to forget that life is short, that beauty is fragile, that wisdom requires humility. They continued to believe that the world is not made to be conquered, but to be understood, that seeing with both eyes still matters, one on the divine, the other on the dirt beneath your feet. They taught that silence is not the same as surrender, and that questions, true questions, outlive kings. So now you may wonder, what happens to a culture's soul when its temples fall? But its questions continue to echo in gardens and dreams. Can philosophy survive if it is never written again, but only whispered? Centuries passed, the pyramids eroded, the empire faded from the maps. Nahuatl was pushed to the edges. The Tlamatinaim were no longer named in official records. Their robes were replaced by coats, their metaphors dismissed as folklore. And yet, a young man walks through a garden in Xochimilco. He pauses beside a marigold. He watches the breeze lift a fallen petal. He remembers something his grandmother said, "We are flowers, born to bloom for a moment and then return to dust. He does not know the name Tlamatini, but the question lives inside him. A philosophy without monuments, unlike Greek or Roman. Thinkers, the Aztec philosophers, left no stone academies, no marble busts, no long scrolls of theory. Their legacy is not built in monuments, it is built in quiet habits. In the way a story is told with an open question at the end. In the pause before responding to a deep thought. In the tendency to value the poetic over the precise. In the willingness to live with mystery, not rush to answer it. Their philosophy is not lost, it is simply quiet. And in today's world, loud, fast, crowded with certainties, that kind of silence may be harder to hear, but it has not vanished. Truth is a garden, not a tower. The Tlamatinaim believed that truth was not a single tall structure to be climbed. It was a garden. Tended, grown, observed. Never perfect, always changing. Each person had their own plot of it, and each had the duty to care for it, to weed, to water, to reflect. One could walk through someone else's garden, admire it, learn from it, but never steal it. This was a radical idea. Not conquest, not conversion, but coexistence. Truth as a living thing, living with uncertainty. Modern minds often crave resolution, final answers, closure. But the Aztec philosophers taught the opposite. They embraced uncertainty. They believed the world was fleeting, and that knowledge came not from controlling it, but from witnessing it, holding it gently, like mist in your hands. A Tlamatini might say, all things are like the smoke from burning copal, real, fragrant, rising, and gone. This wasn't pessimism. It was a kind of freedom. If life is impermanent, then each act of kindness matters more. If beauty fades, then noticing it becomes urgent. If truth shifts, then listening is more important than speaking. Remembering through practice. In rural parts of Mexico today, elements of this thought persist, not in textbooks, but in how people speak. In proverbs, in songs sung at funerals, in altars decorated for Day of the Dead. Children are taught not just to memorize facts, but to reflect on how they live. When someone suffers loss, the comfort is often a phrase, without hard promise, así es la vida. Such is life. Somos como las flores. We are like the flowers. These aren't dismissals. They are echoes. Echoes of the Tlamatinaim, still speaking. Final reflection. Imagine one last scene. Single quiet man sitting beneath a tree, long ago or perhaps just yesterday. He watches the wind move through the grass. He says nothing for a long while, then turns to his student and says, "Do you think the sun knows how beautiful it is?" and smiles, because the question doesn't need an answer. It only needs to be held. So you may ask, if wisdom is not in the words but in the way they're spoken, have the Tlamatinaim truly disappeared? Or are they still walking among us in gardens, dreams, and gentle questions? Before horses, before carts, before concrete, there was the lake. To enter Tenochtitlan, the great Aztec capital, you did not gallop in with dust at your heels. You glided, quietly, over still, shallow water, with nothing but the soft plash of a paddle, the scent of wet reeds, and the distant hum of a city built not on land but on water. Tenochtitlan was not an ordinary city. It was a city of canoes, and its roads were made of lakes. A city in the middle of the lake, the Valley of Mexico, was once a basin of 5 major lakes: Texcoco, Xochimilco, Chalco, Zumpango, and Xaltocan. Each had its own character, some brackish, some fresh, some shallow, some useful for fishing, others for salt-making. Tenochtitlan was founded on a cluster of islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Over time, it was expanded through causeways, canals, and artificial land. It didn't sit beside water, it floated in it. Unlike the dry stone cities of Europe, it glimmered. Travelers arriving for the first time reported disbelief. Like Venice, some said, though Venice was smaller, less orderly, and far less agricultural, Tenochtitlan was not built around nature. It was built with it. Canoes for every occasion. Thousands of canoes filled the lakes and canals around Tenochtitlan, some long and thin for speed, some wide and flat for heavy cargo, some beautifully carved for nobles and priests. Most were plain, hollowed from a single tree trunk, paddled by one or two people. Canoes carried everything: people, flowers, tribute, tools, fish, firewood, soldiers and messages. They moved with silence and precision. There were no horses in Mesoamerica before the Spanish. There were no wheels used for transport. There was only water and the canoe. The sound of the city in most cities. The soundscape includes hooves, wheels, shouting, and stone underfoot. But in Tenochtitlan, the dominant sounds were softer. The rhythmic dip of a paddle, the splash of fish breaking the surface, the rustle of chinampa crops in the breeze. The creak of canoe wood shifting under a basket of goods. And human voices, yes, but not shouting. Canoe traffic was dense yet calm. People waited, gave space, navigated with the practiced flow of those who do it daily. A traffic jam meant a momentary pause in the reeds, then motion resumed. The canals within inside Tenochtitlan. Canals threaded between neighborhoods like streets. Bridges arched over them, many built of wood, designed to be raised if needed. Houses opened directly onto the water, with canoe docks beside the door. Children fished from back steps. Merchants called to one another across narrow channels. Some neighborhoods specialized in fishing, others in farming, still others in crafts. All were connected by water. And while large causeways led out of the city to Tacuba, Tepeyac, Iztapalapa, most local travel was by boat. The city didn't grow despite the lake. It thrived because of it. The morning commute at dawn, the canals, came alive. Farmers from Xochimilco and Chalco paddled north, their canoes piled with chilies, beans, and herbs. Flower vendors balanced tall bundles of marigolds. Salt merchants from the northern lakes brought their loads, covered in damp cloth. Fishermen arrived with baskets of wriggling catch. The markets opened early. The air filled with smells: fresh maize, fish, copal incense. And after trade was done, the canoes went back, this time with cloth, obsidian blades, or bundles of cacao. There were no receipts, no fuel, just water and rhythm, messages and movement. The Aztecs did not have paper money or postal services, but they had messengers, and messengers had canoes. Government couriers paddled quickly across lakes to carry news from town to town, military messages, trade updates, warnings. There were even canoe relays, where one boat passed the message to another for speed, much like a baton in a modern race. In wartime, canoe armies could be mobilized, fast, quiet, able to flank an enemy settlement without warning. The canoe wasn't just a vehicle, it was a strategy. Ceremonial boats. Not all canoes were practical. Some were beautifully adorned, painted, carved, or draped with cloth, for festivals or ceremonies. During religious processions, priests stood in canoes filled with flowers, singing to the gods of water and fertility. On the festival of Tlaloque, young boys were paddled out into the lake to offer small clay figures of fish and frogs, gifts to the rain gods. The boat was not just a vehicle, it was a vessel of meaning. And now you may wonder, how did a city built so deeply into the water survive the pressure of conquest, concrete, and colonization? What became of these waterways when the roads were paved? When the Spanish arrived, they were confused. They had never seen a city like Tenochtitlan. Its shimmering surface, its bridges and canals, its floating gardens and soft silence. It looked more like a mirage than a metropolis. They came expecting roads, they found water, and for a while they allowed it to be. Canoes still glided. Markets still buzzed. The lake still reflected the sky. But slowly the new rulers began to reshape the valley, not with respect for its rhythms, but with straight lines, dry land and stone roads, and the water began to disappear. The siege that brought drought in 1521. During the siege of Tenochtitlan, one of the first Spanish tactics was to disrupt the water. They cut off aqueducts, damaged canals, blocked trade routes through the lakes. They even built their own boats, European-style brigantines, to try to dominate the water. It worked. The city, once so fluid and connected, began to suffocate. After the conquest, these water routes weren't rebuilt. They were filled, walled, replaced with streets, and what was once a canoe city began to dry. Roads replace reeds, The Spanish brought carts, horses, a love for stone roads and plazas. They didn't trust the lake. They wanted to control it, drain it, improve it. Little by little, they filled in the canals, built new causeways that divided the water, dug ditches not for transport, but for sewage, covered the lake's skin with dust and stone. The city grew heavier, and the canoes grew fewer. Some farmers still used them, traveling from the southern Chinampas into the capital. But the routes narrowed, the docks disappeared, the markets changed, and the lake, once ruler of the valley, became a prisoner in its own basin. The drying of the valley by the 1600s and 1700s, vast engineering projects were underway to drain the entire lake system. The Spanish feared flooding. Lake Texcoco had risen dangerously during storms. They sought stability, permanence, predictability, so they built tunnels and canals to remove water from the valley altogether. Entire lakes, Zaltocan, Zampango, Chalco, were lowered or drained. Swamps dried, reed beds vanished. The canoe paths turned to dust, and the water city became a land city. The transformation was not just physical, it was cultural. A people who once measured distance in paddles now measured it in paces. What was lost with the water went a way of life. Children no longer learned to steer by starlight. Markets no longer opened with the sound of paddles arriving. Songs of water deities faded from memory. Frog offerings stopped. The quiet coordination of canal travel gave way to the noise of carts and feet. Tenochtitlan was gone. In its place, Mexico City rose, a city built over water but pretending not to be. Yet underneath, the lake remained, trapped, rising when rains came, soaking basements, cracking buildings. As if the valley itself remembered, the south holds on. In the far south of the city, Xochimilco resisted. There the Chinampas still clung to the water. Farmers still used canoes. The canals were too narrow for roads, too wet for pavement. So they stayed, through colonial rule, through revolution, through urban expansion. Even now, in the early mornings, some farmers still paddle quietly as their ancestors did. Not for tourists, but because it is the best way to move through their world, because the water is still there. A new kind of canoe in modern times. The canoe made a strange comeback, not as a tool of trade, but as a symbol. In Xochimilco, visitors ride brightly painted trajineras, boats named Lupita, Maria, Esperanza, drifting slowly through the remaining canals. There is music, food, color, noise. But beneath the party, a question lingers. What was this place before the speakers, before the vendors? Sometimes a quiet canoe slips past, a farmer with a basket of herbs, a man ferrying lake mud, a flower seller, no music, just movement and memory. And so you may ask, if a city forgets the water beneath it, can it ever truly be stable? Or will the lake, in time, remind it, softly, persistently, patiently, of its past? Modern Mexico City is massive. It hums with traffic, vibrates with noise. Its streets stretch far across the valley, paved over what was once lake and marshland. Buildings rise where water once glistened. Towers grow tall on land that was never meant to bear weight. But beneath it all, the lake still breathes quietly, patiently. And in its memory live the echoes of a time when canoes outnumbered carts, when the city rose from the water like a reflection, and when the rhythm of life was set not by wheels, but by paddles, a city that forgot it floats. In the centuries after the conquest, Mexico City grew heavy. Stone by stone, it pressed downward, on soil, on history, on water. Engineers worked tirelessly to keep it upright. Foundations were sunk, drainage tunnels dug. The lake was pushed farther and farther from the center, but it never truly left. Rainy seasons still bring floods, streets still buckle, buildings tilt, because this city, like Tenochtitlan before it, was not meant for permanence. It was meant to float. And though forgotten, that truth persists. The last canoe routes today, a few canals survive, narrow, winding, edged by wild plants and crumbling docks. In Xochimilco and parts of Tlahuac, traditional farmers still move through the water as they always have. Their canoes are not painted, they are not loud, They carry compost, maize, flowers. They leave at dawn, return before dark, move slowly. They do not pose for pictures. They paddle because they must, because the roads don't reach where they live, because the water still whispers a way forward, because their grandfathers paddled there too. Children on the docks, some children still learn to balance on the edge of a canoe, to plant their feet just right, to hold the paddle, not too loose, not too tight. They learn to move without making ripples, to read the wind on the water's surface, to steer not with strength, but with timing. There are no formal lessons, no certificates, only practice, only patience, and the passing down of a skill that once built a city. The ghost roads below, underneath the city's surface, some of the old canals remain, buried, bricked over, ignored. Construction workers sometimes uncover them. Archaeologists map them. Locals remember their names: Canal Nacional, Canal de la Viga, Canal del Norte. These were once arteries. Now they are ghosts. But sometimes during storms the water finds them again and flows. The memory of the lake. You cannot see the lake from the Zocalo, the grand plaza of modern Mexico City, but it is there, not just beneath the ground, but in the shape of the streets, in the movement of the clouds, in the low places where water pools first. It is in the language. Mexico itself means in the navel of the moon, a reference to the lake island where Tenochtitlan once stood. It is in the art, the music, the food, that once arrived by boat. It is in the rhythm of things, still waiting. A final paddle, imagine, a morning long ago, or perhaps not so long. You wake before the sun. Step into a narrow canoe. The air is cool, mist skims the water. You paddle in silence, past reeds, past floating gardens, past homes that open onto the canal. You pass another canoe. You nod. No words are needed. You carry food, or tools, or flowers. But what you're really carrying is something older, a way of life, a memory in motion. So now you may ask, if water once connected every part of life in this valley, and if it still waits beneath our feet, what might it mean to remember how to float again? War is rarely born from a single cause. It does not begin with the first blow or the first shout. It begins in whispers, in long silences, in grudges that take root like weeds and spread quietly across the years. So it was with the war between the Tepanecs and the people of Tenochtitlan, a conflict that would reshape the entire Valley of Mexico and set the stage for empire. But to understand the war, we must first understand the garden, because the people who went to battle were not conquerors by birth. They were gardeners, and their first victories came not from blades, but from patience. Before the empire, long before the Aztecs ruled the valley, they were newcomers. The Mexica, later known as the Aztecs, arrived in the region as late as the 13th century. They were migrants, wanderers, seen by others as uncultured, backward, even uncivilized. They didn't have their own city. They didn't have great armies. They had labor, they had religion, and they had the ability to survive. They settled on a marshy island in Lake Texcoco, land that no one else wanted, and slowly began to build a city, Tenochtitlan. They grew their food on chinampas. They worshipped gods with blood and song, and they paid tribute to the true power of the valley, the Tepanec city of Azcapotzalco. Who were the Tepanecs? The Tepanecs were the dominant force in central Mexico in the 14th and early 15th centuries. Their capital, Azcapotzalco, sat on the western shore of Lake Texcoco. From there, they controlled tribute, trade, and warfare across the region. They were feared, respected, and well organized. They maintained power not through brute force alone, but through calculated alliances, arranged marriages, and careful management of tribute towns. And for a while, they tolerated the rising Mexica in Tenochtitlan, so long as the Mexica remained loyal, so long as they paid. A quiet subordination for decades, the Mexica served the Tepanecs. They sent food, goods, and laborers. Their rulers answered to Azcapotzalco's king, Tezozomoc, a shrewd and long-lived monarch who had held power for over half a century. In public, Tenochtitlan honored him. In private, resentment grew, because Tenochtitlan was no longer a poor island outpost. It was rising, Its fields were fertile, its people skilled, its warriors, though few, were brave, and its markets were becoming essential to the lake economy. Still, the Mexica waited. They were gardeners, after all. They knew how to let things ripen. Tezozomoc's death in 1426. King Tezozomoc died. He was old, and his reign had held the valley in balance for over 60 years. With his death, succession battles began. His son Maxtla seized power in Azcapotzalco, bypassing his older brother Tayatzin, who had stronger ties to Tenochtitlan. This shift changed everything. Maxtla did not trust the Mexica. He saw their rising power as a threat, and he moved quickly to suppress them. The breaking of the alliance Maxtla demanded higher tribute from Tenochtitlan. He sent spies. He had Chimalpopoca, the Mexica ruler and grandson of Tezozomoc, assassinated, possibly by poison, possibly through trickery. The message was clear. The old relationship was over. Tenochtitlan would kneel, or be crushed. But the Mexica did not kneel. They chose another path. The gardeners turned toward the next ruler of Tenochtitlan. Itzcoatl was not a man of peace. He had grown up in the shadow of tribute demands, temple taxes, and